Common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Premise 1 is constantly verified and never falsified. It's hard to understand how any atheist committed to modern science could deny that premise 1 is more plausibly true than false in light of the evidence. Now, note well that the third reason is an appeal to inductive reasoning, not reasoning by composition. It's drawing an inductive inference about all the members of a class of things based on a sample of the class. Inductive reasoning undergirds all of science and is not to be confused with reasoning by composition, which is a fallacy.
Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Welcome to the third episode of this Kalam series. If you'd like to see the previous 2 chunky episodes, then you can find the playlist link below. And if you'd like to see a whole range of discussions on the Kalam between Joe Schmid and other various players in the literature, then likewise you can find the playlist link below. And talking of Schmid, I'll yield the stage to him.
As a reminder of where we are in the series, we're examining premise 1 of stage 1 of the Old Kalam. Recall that stage 1 of the Kalam aims to infer at least one first cause of the universe, while stage 2 attempts to identify that cause with God. And as we all know by now, the Old Kalam runs as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, so the universe has a cause. In our previous video, we unpacked the terms in premise 1 and clarified what exactly it's saying. With that foundation laid, we examined the argument from intuition in support of the causal principle expressed in that premise.
Being does not come from non-being. Something does not come from nothing. Atheists themselves recognize this truth.
In this video, we'll be examining a second reason in support of premise 1. As we'll explain, the second reason is based on our universal experience of causal order. But before delving into this, we think it'll be helpful to outline the various reasons for and against premise 1 that we'll be examining in our series. To do that, we've created a table giving you a bird's-eye view of the dialectic. We'll cover 5 reasons for the causal principle and 5 reasons against it. What about the reasons for the causal principle? Well, in episode 2 of our series, we covered the argument from intuition. In the current episode, episode 3, we'll cover appeals to induction and inference to the best explanation. In episode 4, we'll cover the argument from chaos. In episode 5, we'll cover Locke's modus tollens argument. And in episode 6, we'll cover the argument from perceptual skepticism. Moving on to reasons against the causal principle, in episode 7, we'll first cover the problem free will might pose for the causal principle, after which we'll cover an argument from conceivability against the principle. Then, in episode 8, we'll cover 3 arguments against the causal principle, one from quantum mechanics, another from non-causal explanations, and a final from philosopher Adolf Grunbaum. Now, if that ain't sufficient reason to get you to subscribe to both our channels, then I don't know what is. Anyway, with all that covered, let's get into the juicy stuff.
Juicy.
Yeah, Joe, you just said let's get to the juicy stuff, but this next section isn't the juicy stuff. It's literally us just clarifying the key concepts of our episode.
Well, I don't know about you, but I find getting clear on key concepts incredibly juicy. In fact, I think it's titillating.
What the hell was even that? Titillating. So let's agree never to use that adjective again, okay? Can we all just objectively agree that that's not an adjective anymore?
Daddy, chill.
What the hell is even that?
Alright, so we have 2 juicy concepts to cover, or maybe they're chunky. In any case, the concepts are induction and inference to the best explanation. Induction is just a fancy term for a form of reasoning in which the premises of an argument support a conclusion, but do not guarantee or ensure its truth. And its logical form is, all observed f's have property p, so probably all f's have property p. Here, f stands for some arbitrary kind of thing, while p stands for some arbitrary property. F, for instance, might be dogs, diamonds, swans, planets, or particles, and p might be having 4 legs, are clear, being white, being spherical, or having negative charge. The reasoning here is inductive rather than deductive because the truth of the premise does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. In principle, it could be the case that the premise is true while the conclusion is false. Nevertheless, the premise is taken to render the conclusion probable. Thus, whenever all observed instances of a phenomena are accompanied by a certain property, we have good reason to infer that, probably, every instance of that phenomena is accompanied by the same property. So let's consider a few examples of inductive reasoning, beginning with the following. All observed physical things obey the law of gravity. So, probably, all physical things obey the law of gravity.
Pretty straightforward. Now, it's important to see that inductive arguments are defeasible. That is, the support that their premises lend to their conclusions can, in principle, be overturned or overridden by countervailing considerations or reasons. Consider that prior to the 17th century, Europeans had observed millions of swans for centuries, and all of them were white without exception. Following inductive reasoning, many Europeans might have argued that, premise 1, all observed swans are white. So, probably, conclusion, all swans are white. But, of course, their inference was defeated in January 1667, when the Dutch explorer Willem de Vlaming reported... Why do I have to be the one who says this? But, of course, their inference was defeated in January 1667, when the Dutch explorer Willem de Vlaming reported black swans in Australia. And yeah, of course it was in Australia, the land in which the most overpowered expansion Pokemon reside.
Bruce is estimated to be about 43 years old, and he came to us from Bristol Zoo in 1993.
What the hell is even that?
The perceptual and testimonial evidence of visitors to Australia served as a defeater for the aforementioned inductive argument. The discovery of adorable black swans knocked all the wind out of the argument, and probably was the Queen's best day ever. Alright, enough of swans and induction.
Alright, don't do that. Don't be silly. Stop it. Stop it.
What about inference to the best explanation? Well, this one is kind of self-explanatory, if you'll pardon the pun. It's a form of reasoning wherein we conclude that the best explanation or account of some range of phenomena is probably true. More specifically, inference to the best explanation takes the following form. For some collection of evidence, a specific hypothesis provides a good explanation of that evidence and explains the evidence better than any available rival hypothesis. So, probably, the specified hypothesis is true.
Again, this form of reasoning is non-deductive and defeasible. It's non-deductive in that the truth of its premise doesn't guarantee the truth of its conclusion, and it's defeasible in that the support the premise provides for the conclusion can, in principle, be overturned or undercut. Nevertheless, this form of reasoning is prevalent in daily life, scientific practice, philosophical inquiry, and beyond. If, for instance, I wake up at midnight to the pitter-patter of what seem to be small feet, and if there's a hole in the kitchen wall and some of my cheese has gone missing, I can conclude that, probably, there's a mouse in my house. I conclude this because such a hypothesis provides a good explanation of the data, firstly, and furthermore, an explanation that's better than all available rival hypotheses. Like, say, the hypothesis that there are ghosts in my house playing a trick on me. With these two key concepts covered, let's now consider the centerpiece of our episode, the inductive and explanatory reasons purportedly favoring the causal principle.
As we've said, our goal for this episode is to investigate the support for premise 1 deriving from inductive generalization and inference to the best explanation. The support begins by noting that the causal principle is constantly confirmed in our experience. According to William Lane Craig, this gives us strong inductive and experiential reason to think that the causal principle is true. Here's how Craig himself puts it. The principle is constantly confirmed in our experience. Scientific naturalists thus have the strongest of motivations to accept it. It is precisely on the strength of the role played by the causal principle in science that the natural philosopher of science Bernulf Kandershiner warns, if taken seriously, the initial singularity is in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment that was a guiding line of research since Epicurus and Lucretius. Namely, out of nothing, nothing comes, which Kandenshiner calls a metaphysical hypothesis which has proved so fruitful in every corner of science that we are surely well advised to try as hard as we can to eschew processes of absolute origin.
In short, the causal principle is unanimously supported by experience. In general, we do in fact find causes when we look for them, and when we don't find them, for example when investigating an unsolved crime, we have reason to think that they're nevertheless there and would be found if only we had all the relevant evidence and the time and resources for a more thorough investigation. Not only is this just what we would expect if the causal principle were true, but it's not at all what we should expect if it were false. Craig isn't alone in his appeal to experiential confirmation. Philosophers Alexander Pruss and Josh Rasmussen, in their 2018 book Necessary Existence, consider principles quite similar to the Kalam's causal principle, and what they say on behalf of such principles can likewise be said on behalf of the Kalam's principle. The principle, they note, is a simple inductive generalization from widespread instances of causal explanation. Causal explanations, after all, are part and parcel of our experience. They write, Steve discovers a puddle of milk on the floor, and he wonders where it came from.
I swear that is milk.
He assumes there is an answer. And he assumes the answer explains, to some extent, the presence of the puddle of milk. Maybe the milk is there because someone spilled milk on the floor. By contrast, Steve doesn't even entertain the idea that the milk may have popped into place without any causal explanation at all. What's true for the milk, or milk, would seem to be equally true for, say, a pile of pebbles that appears on one's doorstep. One expects that there's a cause of its existence, whether or not anyone knows what that cause is. The same holds for a grove of trees that begins to sprout, and for an arbitrary array of stars or particles that form. For big things and small things, heavy things and light things, visible things and invisible things that all come into being. For each such beginning, we expect there to be a cause that brought the thing or things into existence.
In each such case, we either find a cause after looking for one, or we expect with a high degree of confidence that there is such a cause, even if currently unknown. Accordingly, argue Pruss and Rasmussen, it's reasonable to generalise from the many and varied cases of beginnings to exist having causes to the general principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Pruss and Rasmussen also argue that the causal principle is a relatively simple hypothesis, and that there doesn't seem to be a simpler principle that can account for the wide range of apparent instances of causal explanation. What's more, the principle also successfully predicts our widespread experience of things beginning to exist having causes. So, in light of the simplicity, predictive power, and empirical adequacy of the causal principle, we have good reason to think that it's true. Or so the argument goes.
By contrast, if the causal principle were false, we wouldn't predict our widespread experience to make a concerted effort to act as if it's true. That is, we wouldn't expect the principle to be so exceptionally empirically confirmed if it were in fact false. Finally, scientists often reasonably assume that the best among a set of causal explanations is probably the right one. And in ordinary reasoning, when we've ruled out all causal explanations but one, we reasonably take the remaining one to be true, at least tentatively.
In summary, then, the inductive case for the causal principle is based on the fact that all observed beginnings to exist are either known or reasonably expected to have causes, and it inductively generalizes to the conclusion that all beginnings to exist have causes. The inference to the best explanation, on the other hand, is based on the fact that the causal principle not only provides a good explanation of our experiential data concerning beginnings to exist, but also provides a better explanation than any rival hypothesis. Overall, then, we have good reason to think that the causal principle is true. For the remainder of the video, we'll consider 4 responses to the inductive and explanatory arguments for premise 1. A first response involves limiting the scope of the causal principle and arguing that such a restricted principle is equally supported by empirical evidence. For instance, one might limit the scope of the causal principle to everything within the universe, adopting only the principle that everything within the universe that begins to exist has a cause. Alternatively, one might limit the scope to every rearrangement of pre-existing stuff, affirming only that every rearrangement of pre-existing stuff has a cause. If we're only willing to grant either of these limited principles, then we'll be unable to infer that the universe requires a cause, since the universe is not within the universe, and the universe is not, at least according to traditional theism, merely a rearrangement of pre-existing stuff.
Proponents of the Kalam can make several replies at this juncture. First, they'll likely distinguish between alternative principles and competing principles. Notice that the limited principle, that whatever begins to exist within the universe has a cause, is actually perfectly compatible with the more general causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. In fact, the principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause clearly entails that whatever begins to exist within the universe has a cause. Further still, it also entails the principle that every rearrangement of pre-existent stuff has a cause. Put simply, these limiting principles don't actually compete with the Kalam's causal principle. So, suppose you have no reason to think that a universe that begins to exist cannot have a cause. In that case, the truth of one or more of the restricted principles would actually be quite strong evidence in favor of the more general causal principle, since the general principle would successfully predict the truth of those restricted principles. Compare that evidence for the proposition that all naturally occurring diamonds, not including the ones in my hand, are clear, is also evidence that all naturally occurring diamonds, including the ones in my hand, are clear. When the principles don't compete, and when one lacks independent reason to discriminate between cases, evidence for the one is plausibly evidence for the other. I don't actually have naturally occurring diamonds in my hand. It's my AirPod. My right AirPod? Yeah, it's my right AirPod, so... To avoid this, one might try to add to a restricted principle that nothing else requires a cause. But this move only increases the complexity of the principle and lowers its probability by creating tension between its components. This is because the application of a principle to everything apart from X gives us reason to expect, that is, raises the probability of the principle's application to X itself. For instance, the fact that every fossil not including fossil X in a particular stratum is 65 million years old gives us good reason to expect that fossil X is likewise 65 million years old. The hypothesis that every fossil in the stratum except fossil X is 65 million years old is thus intrinsically less probable than the hypothesis that every fossil in the stratum is 65 million years old. This is because the former hypothesis is equivalent to a conjunction. 1. Every fossil in the stratum, not including fossil X, is 65 million years old. And 2. Fossil X is not 65 million years old. And yet, the truth of the first conjunct, 1, actually gives us good reason to expect the falsity of the second conjunct, 2. This means that the different elements of the hypothesis are actually in a kind of tension with one another. Given the first element of the hypothesis, the second element is rendered improbable or surprising. This, in turn, renders the hypothesis as a whole less probable prior to considering the data. This fact can actually be captured mathematically in the notion of probabilistic tension. We won't cover this in depth here, but we mention it for those who, like me, actually enjoy math. Seriously though, don't worry if these equations on the screen don't make much sense. I actually already explained it in a more informal and understandable manner.
That, then, is the first response proponents of the Kalam can make to the objection at hand. The second and third responses are drawn from Josh Rasmussen's article, Does Every Beginning Have a Cause? So, as a second response, note again that a universal principle is simpler and hence intrinsically more likely than competing restricting ones. For example, the principle that all naturally occurring diamonds are clear is simpler than the principle that all naturally occurring diamonds are clear except those in dark, unexplored caves. So if we are to restrict the principle, then we need good reason to do so, otherwise we multiply restrictions beyond necessity. Unless and until the objector provides some principled independent reason for restricting the causal principle to only things within the universe, or to only arrangements of things, we should adopt the unrestricted version.
And keep in mind that not all differences are automatically relevant. In general, every inductive generalization will extend to a class C of unobserved things, and there will be differences between members of C and non-members. Merely citing these differences is not by itself enough to call a principle into question. To draw out this point, take again the principle that every naturally occurring diamond is clear. This principle is an extrapolation that goes beyond the naturally occurring diamonds that we've observed. It applies, for example, to diamonds produced in dark, unexplored caves. But suppose someone objects that we have no experience with diamonds produced in dark, unexplored caves. Hence, we have no motivation to conclude that diamonds produced in dark, unexplored caves will be clear, for we have never actually seen their color. Notice, however, that this objection rests on an unstated assumption. The assumption is that the location of diamonds produced in dark, unexplored caves would be relevant to their color. Now, being in a dark, unexplored cave is a difference between those unobserved diamonds and the diamonds that we have observed. But unless we have a reason to think that this difference is relevant, restricting the principle is simply unmotivated. And, importantly, whether or not something is within the universe, or whether or not something is an arrangement of things, just doesn't seem relevant to whether it has a cause of its beginning. The third and final response is that our evidence base isn't limited to our positive experiences of beginnings having causes. It also includes our lack of experience of uncaused beginnings. We observe right now, for instance, that random chunks of matter, both arrangements of things and simpler things that form arrangements, are not flooding into existence. Why don't they? No matter where we go or what time it is, we repeat this observation of causal order again and again. Our consistent observation of causal order, uninterrupted by, say, floods of simple particles coming into existence, is evidence. This evidence itself supports the simple universal principle that things, both arrangements of things and the simpler things that form arrangements, never come into existence uncaused.
The burden, then, and as we've emphasised, is to provide an adequate reason to restrict the causal principle. For instance, one might reason that we've never actually experienced things beginning to exist. Instead, we merely have experience of already existent things being rearranged. Our inductive evidence base, therefore, only consists in seeing rearrangements of pre-existing stuff having a cause, and in that case, we should only be prepared to generalise that every rearrangement of pre-existing stuff has a cause.
Two things can be said in response to this example. First, we know that some kinds of quarks, which are, as far as we currently know, not composed of simpler things, can turn into other kinds of quarks. This doesn't seem to be a case of already existent things being rearranged to form a new composite object. Instead, it's a case of a simple, fundamental particle beginning to exist. Second, many composite objects aren't merely arrangements of pre-existent things. For instance, I exist, but I'm not identical to an arrangement of a particular group of particles. For any particle you choose at random, you could replace that particle with a distinct but qualitative duplicate particle, and I wouldn't thereby cease to exist. I'm also constantly gaining and losing particles, and yet I obviously exist throughout that. So, given that many composite objects exist and aren't merely arrangements of pre-existent things, and given that we've seen many such composite objects begin to exist with causes, it follows that our experience supporting the Kalam's causal principle isn't merely of already existent things simply being rearranged. And upon reflection, this seems kind of obvious, really. I exist now, but I didn't exist a million years ago. Yeah, the particles that currently compose me probably existed a million years ago, but it's just absurd to say that I existed a million years ago. And what this means is that I began to exist, and so our evidence base does include things genuinely beginning to exist.
Objections such as these urge us to refine and clarify what we mean when we say that we have no experience of things beginning to exist. One way of refining our point is to specify that we have no experience of material things coming into being from nothing. That is, we have no experience of material things beginning to exist without being made from pre-existing things or stuff. One might add, further, that this lack of experience is, indeed, a relevant difference between the beginnings within the universe and the beginnings of the universe itself, that is, the beginning of all of material reality. This relevant difference between the case, one might continue, is a reason to limit the scope of the causal principle. Consider again the case of naturally occurring diamonds, which we hereon refer to as simply diamonds. While most would agree that it's reasonable to infer from the fact that all observed diamonds are clear that, probably, diamonds in dark, unexplored caves on Earth are clear, it's doubtful that most would agree that it's reasonable to infer that, probably, all diamonds whatsoever are clear. That is, that all diamonds across the observable and unobservable universe, on potentially billions of different celestial bodies, each accompanied by otherworldly pressures and environments, are also clear. While this altered analogy is no doubt imperfect, it serves to contextualize the fact that we've only experienced a tiny fraction of the universe, as well as a tiny fraction of its various scales. And yet, despite this, the Kalam causal principle beckons us to endorse a vast cosmological inference. More to the point, just as it's a live possibility that otherworldly pressures, temperatures, and environments might serve as a relevant difference for diamonds and their transparency, perhaps something coming into being from nothing serves as a relevant difference for requiring a cause, or so the detractor of the inductive argument might argue.
Defenders of the inductive argument, in turn, will probably respond to the detractor by asking them the following question. What exactly is it about coming into being without being made from pre-existent stuff that could explain why that sort of beginning wouldn't require a cause, while other sorts of beginnings do? Remember, the burden is on the detractor to pinpoint and explain why there's a relevant difference that allows them to discriminate between cases. To successfully rebut the inductive argument, then, the detractor should be prepared to offer an answer to this question. Unfortunately, we don't have the space to pursue this particular dialectic further. We simply want to give you guys a sense of how the dialectic is likely to play out, as well as the various moves each party can make in it. Our principal goal here, again, is to equip you with the tools to think critically about these arguments for yourselves. The path to truth isn't easy. It's paved with arguments, objections, rejoinders, intuitions, clarifications, refinements, and so on. It takes courage to think for yourself, to think through the dialectic, and to reach a reasoned conclusion. But the reward is intellectual autonomy and a greater understanding of reality. In truth, one's personal web of beliefs is probably going to strongly influence which of the prior analogies you find befitting, as well as which side of the dialectic sketched above you're going to fall on. At least as far as we can see, though, there's room for reasonable disagreement here.
But there is one final point to make before moving on. Even if we don't have adequate reason to restrict the principle itself, we certainly have good reason to exhibit intellectual humility when making sweeping inductive generalizations. In other words, we have good reason to limit our degree of confidence in the relevant inductive inference to the unrestricted principle. To illustrate this point, consider again the 17th century. Just as Europeans were mistaken to claim that all swans are white based on their limited geographical data, we today have only explored a tiny fraction of the observable universe as well as a tiny fraction of its various scales. Moreover, the discoveries we have made in the last century alone have significantly challenged and in some cases completely overturned what was previously extremely convincing inductive generalizations. Where we once believed that Earth will always be greeted by another sunrise, we now don't, courtesy of principled independent reasons. Where we once believed gravitational laws applied universally, we now think there are certain domains or contexts in which they break down. Inductive generalizations are quite defeasible, and so while they provide some reason to accept their conclusions, that reason is tentative. But speaking of principled independent reasons, it is to this suggestion that we turn next. A second response notes that both inductive generalizations and inferences to a universal principle as the best explanation for phenomena can be defeated if we have principled, independent reasons for making exceptions to an otherwise universal principle, or if we have reasons for thinking that our evidence base is unrepresentative of the space over which we're generalizing. One such principled reason might be the claim that causation is essentially a temporal relation. That is, that causes must bear some temporal relation to their effects, such as being earlier than or simultaneous with. If that's true, then, if we assume, along with Craig, that time itself has a beginning and that there cannot be an infinite number of causes, it simply follows that time is something that begins to exist and yet cannot be caused to begin to exist.
Absurd.
Daddy, chill.
Now, it's important to note that this only serves as a principled reason for restricting the causal principle if we can support the claim that causation is essentially a temporal relation. Thus, if one wants to level this response, one needs to offer reasons favouring the temporal character of causation. One such reason could come precisely from inductive generalization. Because all observed causal relations are temporal, we can conclude that, probably, all causal relations are temporal. Yeah, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, to borrow one of Craig's favourite sayings.
What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
But there is another, less ambitious way to defeat the inductive and explanatory inferences to the causal principle. In particular, one can argue that it's simply not at all clear whether or not causation is an essentially temporal relation. If one can support this, then, assuming along with Craig that time has a beginning, we'll have good reason not to conclude that whatever begins to exist has a cause. More specifically, we'll have good reason to suspend judgment on whether the beginning of time itself has a cause, in which case we'll have reason not to accept the causal principle. An analogy might be helpful here. Imagine you're a doctor. You know that one of your patients has two conditions, A and B. You also know that condition B is normally associated with low blood sugar. Given just this information, you would have good inductive reason to think that the patient has low blood sugar. But now suppose you know some additional information. In particular, you know that it's unclear whether condition A raises blood sugar from low levels back to healthy levels. That is, you have reason to think it's not clear whether condition A counteracts the low blood sugar levels associated with condition B. With this additional information in hand, it seems obvious that you shouldn't automatically conclude that your patient has low blood sugar. The very fact that it's unclear whether condition A would counteract condition B's associated low blood sugar should lead you to suspend judgment on whether your patient has low blood sugar. Thus, if you know that it's unclear whether condition A counteracts condition B's associated low blood sugar, you shouldn't conclude from the fact that this patient has condition B, which is normally associated with low blood sugar, to the conclusion that this patient has low blood sugar. The inductive support that the former lends to the latter is undercut or undermined by the fact that it's unclear whether condition A counteracts condition B's associated low blood sugar. But now transfer this reasoning to the case of the causal principle. We know that beginnings are normally associated with causes. Given just this information, we would have good inductive reason to conclude that some unobserved beginning, say the beginning of time, likewise has a cause. But now suppose you know some additional information. In particular, you know that it's unclear whether causation is an expressly temporal relation. With this additional information in hand, it seems obvious that you shouldn't automatically conclude that the beginning of time has a cause. This is because the only thing that could cause the beginning of time is something timeless, which in turn requires that causation is not an expressly temporal relation. If then you know that it's unclear whether causation is an expressly temporal relation, you shouldn't conclude from the fact that beginnings normally have causes to the conclusion that the beginning of time has a cause. The inductive support that the former lends to the latter is thus undercut or undermined by the fact that it's unclear whether causation is an expressly temporal relation.
Thus, if we have independent reason to think it's unclear whether causation is an essentially temporal relation, then we ought to suspend judgment on the inductive and explanatory inferences to the causal principle. And in that case, the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle don't succeed. Now, exploring the debate on whether causation is an essentially temporal relation would take us too far afield given present purposes. Suffice it to note that if you can support that claim, or else show that it's unclear whether the claim is true, you will have defeated the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle. A third response to the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle is that there are principles incompatible with the kalam, or traditional theism more generally, that are equally supported by induction and inference to the best explanation. Consider some of the principles that we explored in our previous episode. 1. Every material object that begins to exist has a material cause, that is, some stuff from which it is made. Another principle is that causes must either be before or simultaneous with their effects, and yet another is, every case of mental causation is durational, that is, whenever a mind produces an effect, the mind undergoes some temporal process in doing so. Each of these principles is constantly confirmed in our experience. They've proved fruitful in both scientific practice and ordinary reasoning. They're each incredibly simple and elegant hypotheses that successfully predict and explain our widespread empirical support for them, and so on. If one believes the Kalam causal principles for such reasons, it seems that one should also believe these principles for such reasons, and yet, as we saw in our previous episode, believing these principles requires us giving up the Kalam and or traditional theism. One might, of course, claim that one or more of these principles are defeated by the arguments for the finitude of the past, perhaps together with the Kalam's causal principle or an analysis of the characteristics of the cause of the universe. Craig, for instance, says the following.
The principle that everything that comes into existence has a material cause, if it has a cause at all, is indeed powerfully supported by inductive evidence. But it gets defeated by the evidence for the beginning of the universe, which cannot have a material cause.
Oh, and by the way, that clip is from Craig's response to Skydive Phil's Kalam documentary, and if you want a brilliant takedown of Craig's 4-part response to the documentary, look no further than Nathan Ormond and James Fodor's recent Bad Apologetics episode featuring Skydive Phil and philosopher of physics Daniel Linford. They pick apart Craig's response with masterful skill, so you're in for a major treat if you watch it.
But back to Craig's response. According to Craig, the principle that for whatever begins to exist has a material cause, if it has a cause at all, is defeated by the evidence for the beginning of the universe. But it's not hard to see why this response is thoroughly unconvincing. First, we could equally say that the evidence for the beginning of the universe is itself defeated by the powerful inductive, experiential, and explanatory support for Principle 4.
Second, while material cause might suggest matter and energy, we actually defined it as the things or stuff from which something is made. This need not be matter or energy. It might be the case, for instance, that there is a non-material entity that causes the universe to begin to exist by transforming itself in some way or partitioning itself off in some manner. What this means is that Craig is simply wrong to insist that Principle 4 is incompatible with the beginning of the universe and matter more generally.
Third, the beginning of the universe is perfectly compatible with Principle 4. This principle could be true if the universe begins to exist without a material cause, since the latter is compatible with the universe having no cause whatsoever. In which case, we have no violation of the principle that whatever begins to exist has a material cause if it has a cause at all. And so Craig is simply wrong to say that the evidence for the beginning of the universe defeats Principle 4. Now, Craig might of course claim that Principle 4 is, after all, incompatible with such evidence, together with the Kalam's causal principle, and so we should reject Principle 4 on this basis. But again, we could equally say that the evidence, together with Principle 4, is incompatible with the Kalam's causal principle, and that we should therefore reject the Kalam's causal principle on this basis. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
Overall then, we don't think Craig has dealt any serious blows to the criticism from Kalam unfriendly principles. We should also keep in mind that there are lots of other Kalam unfriendly and or theism unfriendly principles that, compared to the Kalam's causal principle, seem equally supported by induction and inference to the best explanation. We'll consider two such principles here.
5. Every concrete object has a cause. Note that something is concrete just in case it's able to cause something. This principle is even simpler than the Kalam's causal principle, and it's just as empirically confirmed. Induction therefore supports it just as much as the Kalam's causal principle. Moreover, it provides an illuminating explanation of why everything concrete in our experience has a cause. But, of course, it's incompatible with both traditional theism and the Kalam. It's incompatible with traditional theism because it implies that God has a cause, which traditional theism denies, and it's incompatible with the Kalam because if everything concrete has a cause, then for any arbitrary concrete thing x, it was caused by x1, which was caused by x2, which was caused by x3, and so on ad infinitum. And this infinite regress violates both the new Kalam's commitment to causal finitism as well as the philosophical case for premise 2 of the old Kalam.
It's also interesting to note that Principle 5 is compatible with the Kalam's causal principle. The Kalam's causal principle, after all, just says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is compatible with everything concrete that doesn't begin to exist requiring a cause as well. Given that Principle 5 actually predicts the truth of the Kalam's causal principle, moreover, if the latter is true, it actually provides evidence for the former's truth as well.
Now, one might think that there are independent reasons to reject this principle that don't apply to the Kalam's causal principle. We'll briefly consider two such reasons. First, consider the totality of everything concrete. This totality can't have a cause, for any such cause would itself be part of the totality, since the totality includes everything concrete, and by definition, anything that has causal power is concrete. But if the cause is itself part of the totality, it cannot be what causally produced the entire totality to begin with, for then it would be causally producing itself, and nothing can causally produce itself. After all, in order to causally bring itself into existence, it would have had to have already existed, and so its existence would have been prior to itself, which is absurd.
But this first reason isn't convincing. First, it assumes that the totality of everything actually exists as a concrete object. But why should we think that? Why think there is this thing or object called the totality of everything that exists over and above the particular objects within the totality? Indeed, this just seems like a deeply implausible assumption. Just as there is nothing composed exactly of Donald Trump's left ear, my big toe, the Eiffel Tower, and the city of New York, there's nothing composed of absolutely everything concrete. And even if there were such a thing, it's not at all clear that it would be a concrete object, as opposed to some amalgamation or collection of objects, which is not itself an object. Second, even if such a totality actually exists, and even if it counts as a concrete object, we can avoid the issue of self-causation by modifying the original principle as follows. 5 star. Every concrete object has a partly causal explanation for why it exists. This too is incompatible with theism, since God can't even have a partly causal explanation for why he exists. God, after all, is entirely uncaused. And crucially, it avoids the self-causation problem, since the totality of everything concrete can have a partly causal explanation in terms of something within the totality without this partial cause being self-caused. Consider that part of the reason why the totality exists is because I exist. After all, if I didn't exist, the specific totality of everything concrete that actually exists wouldn't itself exist. It would instead be a different totality made up of different things. Thus, whatever caused my existence partly causally explains why the totality of everything exists. It doesn't, of course, wholly explain it, but it does offer a partial or incomplete causal explanation of it. And none of this requires self-causation. It simply requires that something caused me to exist. And that's obviously true, right? My parents caused me to exist.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Just the tips? I can't believe we're doing this.
I know, we're so naughty.
But let's get back on track by considering the second reason one might offer against Principle 5 that allegedly breaks its symmetry with the Kalam's causal principle. This second reason is that Principle 5, unlike the Kalam's causal principle, seems to imply an infinite past, For if every concrete object has a cause, then any concrete object X was caused by 1x, which was caused by 2x, which was caused by 3x, and so on ad infinitum into the infinite past. And yet an infinite past, so the thought goes, is absurd. Thus, we have a symmetry breaker between Principle 5 and the Kalam's causal principle.
But this second reason isn't convincing either. First, it's just false that Principle 5 entails an infinite past. In other words, Principle 5 is perfectly compatible with a finite past. Just imagine that the earliest second of temporal reality is structured like the following. An object comes into existence at the first second, which was caused by an object that came into existence at the first half second, which was caused by an object that came into existence at the first quarter of a second, which was caused by an object that came into existence at the first eighth of a second, and so on. In such a situation, we can suppose that every concrete object has a cause. Nevertheless, the past is finite in such a situation. Thus, Principle 5 is entirely compatible with a finite past. What's more, Principle 5 could be true even if there was a temporally first concrete object that came into existence and was caused by a timeless concrete object. This timeless concrete object must simply itself be caused by another timeless object, which in turn was caused by another timeless object, and so on ad infinitum. This is yet another reason why Principle 5 is perfectly compatible with a finite past. Note, though, that this second situation does require that causation isn't an essentially temporal relation. But assuming the Kalam shows that time itself began to exist, the claim that causation isn't essentially temporal is already granted by the Kalam proponent, and so appealing it to it here is perfectly kosher.
Second, even if Principle 5 entails an infinite past, the response in question is a dangerous move. Taking it renders the arguments from induction and inference to the best explanation for the causal principle parasitic on arguments against the infinite past. If those arguments fail, as we'll argue that they do in future episodes, then it would follow that the arguments from induction and inference to the best explanation for the causal principle likewise fail. This is also why it would be dangerous to use, say, causal finitism, or the alleged impossibility of actual infinites as a symmetry breaker between Principle 5 and the Kalam's causal principle.
Third, if we grant, again hypothetically, that Principle 5 entails an infinite past, and is thus incompatible with the standard arguments employed for the past's finitude, it would be a mistake to simply reject the principle. For Principle 5 itself can provide grounds for rejecting those arguments for the finitude of the past. The very fact that Principle 5 enjoys powerful inductive, experiential, and explanatory support gives us reason to reject the arguments for the finitude of the past. Whether the reason is all things considered convincing is another matter, of course, but it's undeniable that it gives us some reason here. Again, assuming, as we shouldn't, that Principle 5 entails an infinite past.
That then caps off Principle 5, which leads us to Principle 6. Every event is temporally preceded by another event. This principle is a simple, elegant generalization from our universal experience of events. After all, every event we've observed is preceded by another event, and so we have powerful inductive support for Principle 6. Moreover, a simple and illuminating explanation for these universal observations is that it's simply in the nature of events to come after other events. But, of course, Principle 6 is incompatible with the Kalam, since it implies an infinite temporal regress of events.
Again, one might say that the inductive and explanatory arguments for Principle 6 are simply defeated by the arguments against infinite temporal regresses. But as before, this is a perilous move. Taking it renders the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle parasitic on the arguments against infinite temporal regresses. And we've already seen why this is dangerous for the proponent of the Kalam. Moreover, it would be a mistake to simply reject Principle 6 because it conflicts with arguments against infinite temporal regresses. Even if you think those arguments are plausible, you need to weigh this against the powerful inductive, experiential, and explanatory grounds for accepting Principle 6. In other words, the support for Principle 6 is itself a reason to reject those arguments. Again, whether it's an all things considered reason to reject those arguments will depend on your particular epistemic situation. But it's a reason nonetheless.
That, then, caps off Principle 6. Again, much more can be said both on this principle and other Kalam unfriendly principles more generally. For purpose of space, though, what we've said here suffices. To sum up our second response, we've argued that if one believes the Kalam's causal principle based on induction and inference to the best explanation, it seems one should also believe principles 1 through 6 for precisely the same reasons. And yet, as we've seen, believing these principles requires giving up the Kalam. Of course, an alternative option would involve showing why we should prefer the Kalam causal principle over the array of Kalam unfriendly principles. But, as we explained in our previous episode, this will be an exceedingly difficult feat, and the burden is on the proponent of the kalam to meet it.
A final response specifically targets the inductive argument for the causal principle. The response is that the inductive argument commits the fallacy of composition, that is, the fallacy of assuming that the whole has some feature simply because its parts have that feature. The idea is that the argument infers that the beginning of the whole universe has a cause simply because the beginning of everything within the universe, that is, every part of the universe, has a cause. But this is clearly a fallacy. Just because every individual particle composing me, say, is invisible, we clearly can't infer that I am invisible.
What to make of this response? Well, notice that the inductive argument isn't actually an inference from the properties of parts to the properties of their whole. Instead, it's just a simple inductive generalization of the following form. First, we have good reason to think that all observed things that begin to exist have causes, together with the defeasible inductive principle that if all observed f's have property p, then probably all f's have property p, we can infer that, probably, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The argument then is as follows, where the property in question is the property of having a cause. All observed things that begin to exist have causes. If all observed f's have property p, then probably every f has property p. So, probably, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Notice that there isn't any inference here from the properties of parts to the properties of wholes. Premise 2 is simply an inductive rule of inference widely used in scientific, philosophical, and ordinary reasoning. Premise 1 simply notes the causal order and regularity we see around us. We don't witness things coming into being all willy-nilly, with no cause whatsoever. And of course, the conclusion simply follows from the premises. Thus, the fallacy of composition charge is misguided.
But perhaps we can charitably understand the fallacy of composition charge as saying that there is a relevant difference between our inductive evidence base on the one hand and the space over which we want to generalize on the other. Our inductive evidence base includes our ordinary experience of beginnings, together with the beginnings of very small and very large things observed using scientific instruments. But the space over which we want to generalize includes absolutely everything that begins to exist, including the whole of spacetime itself if it began to exist. But, so the thought goes, there are relevant differences between the whole of spacetime and things within spacetime when it comes to having a cause of their existence. In particular, any candidate cause of time itself must be timeless, whereas this isn't true of the causes of things within spacetime. Furthermore, one might think, causation is essentially a temporal relation, or, at the very least, a timeless cause cannot issue in a temporal effect. If one can justify either of these claims, or even show that it's unclear whether the claims are true, then one will indeed have defeated the inductive argument for the causal principle. Notice, however, that this is essentially the second response to the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle that we already covered. We therefore have the following situation here. The fallacy of composition charge, on a natural interpretation, is simply mistaken, since the inductive argument for the causal principle doesn't make any inference from the properties of parts to the properties of wholes. But on a charitable interpretation, the fallacy of composition charge reduces to the second response we already considered. Those who want to level the fallacy of composition charge are therefore advised to check out our second response to the inductive and explanatory arguments. We also direct them to our first response, wherein we discuss restricted principles and probabilistic tension.
Well done, legends, you got through the episode. If your head hurts, then, well, join the club. Before recapping, a few hearty thank yous are in order. First and foremost, of course, a huge thank you to Joe Schmid of the Majesty of Reason for this absurdly awesome ongoing collaboration. I want to again urge everyone to check out his channel and the playlist link below. You won't regret it. Secondly, and as always, my love goes out to all of my patrons and YouTube members, who without this video simply wouldn't exist. I'm always humbled by the fact that you see merit in the worth of my work and mission. Thank you.
And a very special thanks to Josh Rasmussen, who, in addition to being both brilliant and kind, was generous enough to offer some feedback on portions of our script.
And I just want to reiterate what Joe's just said, and that is a big thank you to you, Josh, for all of your work, for you helping out with this series, and, well, just for all that you've done for the entire community. So, thank you very much. Alrighty, let's recap. We began our episode by focusing on the causal principle expressed in the Kalam's first premise, according to which whatever begins to exist has a cause. We also gave a bird's eye view of 5 reasons for the causal principle and 5 reasons against the causal principle that we'll be covering in our series. We then explained 2 key concepts for the episode. First, induction, which reasons that because all observed Fs have property P, probably all Fs have property P. And second, inference to the best explanation, which reasons that an explanation is probably true because it provides not only a good explanation of the data, but the best explanation available for it. Next, we explain the arguments for the causal principle based on induction and inference to the best explanation. The first argument, in short, is that every observed beginning to exist has a cause, so probably everything that begins to exist has a cause. The second argument, again in short, is that the causal principle provides the best explanation of our experiential data concerning beginnings to exist. We subsequently examined 4 responses to the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle. The first response is that there are reasons for restricting or limiting the scope of the causal principle. The second response is that the inductive and explanatory arguments for the causal principle face defeaters. In other words, various considerations undermine the inductive and explanatory support for the causal principle. The third response is that induction and inference to the best explanation equally support principles that are incompatible with the Kalam and/or traditional theism. As we saw, induction and inference to the best explanation arguably do more harm than good for the Kalam. The fourth and the final response is that the inductive argument for the causal principle commits a fallacy of composition. We pointed out that on a natural reading this response is mistaken, and on a charitable reading it reduces to the second response we considered. And that is all she wrote. Thank you all again for the view, really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you in the comments on the next one. Thanks.